Hello everyone and welcome back to Getting Started with World Creator 2. In this video, we are going to cover the basics to creating a surface and all its features and settings to get you started, and there is a lot to cover. So the first setting you see under Fractal Properties is the seed value. This essentially is an integer value used to input into the equation of the generator, of which determines the random elevation values of the terrain. So you can see if I press minus or plus, it'll add or subtract a value. And doing this adds a completely different terrain, giving you a unique result. Also, this R button here is a random value. So you can press this millions of times and it'll give you a completely random number each and every time, thus resulting in a very unique landscape. The areas button here is something that we're going to cover in a later video, so don't worry about that just yet. Here under the terrain size category, this is where you get to set your overall resolution or terrain size. The first little checkbox you see is the size locked. What this does, it allows you to create any size that you want regardless of it being even. So let's just change this to some random value like 3067. All right, and so now I'm going to focus back by pressing F again, and you can see it doesn't have to be a square. It could be something completely random, such as 1, 2, 3, 4. So it gives you a very unique resolution or very unique terrain size for whatever you want. So I'm going to set these back to 2K. 1 second. And I'm going to focus back to our original by pressing F again. So the terrain size, any size, does not require you to specify a tile size like Unreal Engine 4, for example. So if you are creating for Unreal Engine 4, go to their website for information on recommended settings for your resolution you want. Or just test a size in the UE4 editor, then make your terrain size in World Creator 2 match that so there's no conflictions. But we will eventually go through the process of how to export or connect your terrain to UE4 and Unity 5 alike. We even might consider running into Lumberyard and showing you how to export to that, since it's Amazon's new engine. Anyway, so we could check this, and if we want to change the size say to 4K, it keeps the size of the terrain proportionate. So it's pretty handy if you're wanting to make a square or rectangle or whatever size you want. There's literally no limitations. And so this height range here is essentially, well, first let me enable my observer tools. So now that you see the minimum and the maximum of the terrain. So the terrain height range is essentially the values that you've set that the min and max generator will produce within those numbers. So for example, if I take the minimum terrain value and drag it down, you can see the terrain is adding more depth. Or if I take the maximum value here, you see the terrain is now increasing in height ever so slightly. And the min and max terrain heights in the Z elevation are changing accordingly. In the next area we have here is the precision setting. Precision is a setting to further refine your terrain's resolution and details. What this does is it specifies the precision of the amount of subdivisions in the terrain's mesh. If you aren't familiar with the term subdivision in 3D modeling, it is essentially describing how large or small a grid is on the mesh, and that grid is made up of vertices or lines in either a pattern of triangles or quads. So World Creator 2 is set up much like a game's rendering engine, so it uses tris, not quads. This is because mathematically triangles are easier to calculate for the game's real-time engine versus quads. The downside though is that tris are typically not as smooth as quads. Fortunately, World Creator 2's mesh is all quads, which are then again subdivided into tris, giving you the best of both worlds, for the most part at least. This is much like bringing an OBJ or FBX file from your modeling program into a game engine such as Unity or UE4. The engine will convert the quads into tris anyways. With that out of the way, let me show you exactly what this precision level does. So you can see here it says precision level of 1 meter. That means if across this entire terrain for every 1 meter, that's what it's going to be using as a mesh. So let me bump this up to half a meter. So now you see that the resolution of the terrain is now 4K. Even though the physical size is 2K, the resolution and details are 4K. So now, based on what this says, every half meter will be a different detail in the mesh. Let me take this back to 1 meter, and I'm going to turn on wireframe mode and then further zoom in to show you exactly what this is doing. Okay, now you can see here's the quad, and that quad is subdivided into 2 tries. And that is based on 1 meter. So essentially from this vertice to this vertice is 1 meter, and this vertice to this vertice is another meter, etc., etc., etc. There is some funky mess, so sometimes the terrain will do this, and I'm not exactly sure why that is, but you get the general idea of what this is doing. So now if I take this precision from 1 meter and scoot it to half meter, you will see that this mesh just got ever so much more fine. Let me take it back just to show you. 1 meter, half meter, or a quarter meter. Ooh, not too much. We'll get that in a second. So a quarter meter is even smaller, and it produces an 8K resolution map. Well, this makes me bring out another good point that I mentioned in the previous video. This 8K resolution is the maximum size the real-time generator will produce, so keep that in mind. So you can make a much larger landscape, thousands and thousands of kilometers long and wide, but you'll be resulting to what I said in the previous video about that little generation button down here. So don't worry about that just yet. So we're going to take this back to 1 meter. We're going to focus back up and press wireframe again. This next category is the soils property. This is essentially just a visual representation for you as the creator. So see what happens when I turn off soil here. It just takes you straight back to the mesh. And let's zoom around let's zoom back in and zoom around the mesh a little bit. And you can see that it just looks like several lines of planes. And if we turn the soil back on, you can see that it gives you some depth. This is just a general representation for you, but what I would recommend, instead of keeping this at the 350 default, which stands for 350 meters, I take this and set it all the way to 1. You can't do 0 for some reason, but you could do 1. And I like to keep it at 1 because visually when you're designing, you can see exactly where the lowest points of your terrain are and even the highest points on the cuts. So it's letting you know how much deeper or how thick certain areas of the terrain are of your actual terrain without adding more depth that's unnecessary. So that's just my personal tip on the visual representation of the soil property. The next area I want to show you is the custom base shape feature. This allows you to manually edit the elevation values of the mesh as if you were pushing and pulling the mesh with your fingers. For example, click the custom base shape and then click edit shape. And then you will see right here, you'll see a set of white spheres appear over the terrain. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to click and I'm going to drag, and now you can see that the terrain is pushing and pulling just like I described. So keep in mind, these spheres are based on a 512 by 512 resolution, which makes sense because our terrain is 2K. So 512 plus 512 plus 512 and another 512 equals 2,048 meters. And keep in mind that if you go up higher in terrain resolution, or sorry, not resolution, but terrain size, physical size, you will get more spheres to adjust. But what if you don't want a higher resolution, but you just want more spheres to adjust? Well, here's a little tip. To increase the amount or density of these spheres, just lower the first level step down to 0. So this level strength step 1, lower it down to 0. And now you can see, instead of the spheres adjusting based on a 512 by 512 area, they are now adjusting based on a 256 by 256 area. If you need even more adjusting, you can take the second slider right down here to 0, and you will see the density of the spheres, let me just do that, are now adjusting even more. This can be repeated so on and so forth down the step. This is a trick to edit your terrain at a fine detail, but then slide this level steps back to where they were if you need to smooth things out. So let's adjust some values here. Some really strong values. Now, let's set this back to 100. And set this back to 100. And you will see, even though that we edited on a much finer sphere, you can see right here, this bumps up just a little further. Now, you don't have to take the level strength step sliders back to their default values. You can keep them at a much lower value. This is just saying if you didn't want things as sharp as you had intended when you start adjusting 100 of these spheres, you can go back to where you were and essentially have a good basis, a good smooth basis of what you just did. And now, as you can see, there are two more adjustments here that you could play with. The first one that we have been using is a single sphere adjustment, but you can select a group of spheres right here based on a circle and based on a rectangle. If you select one of these and try to edit the terrain, but doesn't look any different from where you had just selected the individual spheres, it all has to do with, one, the resolution of the circle or square you've adjusting, and two, the generator's level steps. And to illustrate this for you, I'm going to make the terrain completely flat. Now to do this, just click Flatten Terrain right under here. And it's going to ask you, are you sure you want to do this? Yes. Which, by the way, this feature is very handy if you are importing a height map into World Creator 2 and you want that height map to start from a blank canvas. But we will cover how to do this at a much later date. So now that I have my flattened terrain, you can see that it is much easier to see what we're doing here. But you can also tell that nothing had changed with editing these spheres. So I have the circle tab selected and it's still just adjusting one sphere. Why is this? Well, this is because right here, the radius, if we lower this radius, it's not going to do anything. But if we increase this radius higher than 512, let's say if we increase it to 750 about, oh, look now. You can see that it's selected even more spheres. So what is this radius? Well, this radius is essentially judging the resolution of the circle or judging the resolution of the rectangle. And we'll do the rectangle in just 1 minute. So remember when I said that each one of these single spheres adjusts a 512 by 512 resolution by default? Well, this radius adjusts that resolution fall off. So now that I'm below 512, it's only going to select one. So let's take this up to 1K. So now it's going to be selecting 1K's worth of spheres, but the fall off is set to 0.01. The fall off is essentially the blending between the white spheres and the red spheres. So a value of 0.01 fall off is essentially no blending. It's just straight, sharp edges. But let's take this up to about half. Now that I have the center sphere here selected, you could see there's 4 other spheres that are slightly dimmed. Let's just increase this a tad bit more. How about 75%? And you can see now, you see what it's doing? It's granulating or giving you a gradient of all the spheres around the center sphere, which is the circle. So now if I click and drag or push and pull, it'll adjust based on that sphere's fall off. Now let's take a look at the rectangle settings. The rectangle, same thing, but now you have 2 extras. You get to judge the resolution and width is 512, and you get to judge the resolution and length is 512. Let's say if I want the length to be something really, really tiny, and I want the width to be something really high. Let's go all the way up to 1K. I could just type this in. I don't know why I'm doing this. All right, so now look what it's doing. I'm selecting one here. And now you're adjusting based on the values that we just set. And just like the circle, we have a width fall off and a length fall off. So let's take these values halfway. I'm not sure which one's the length here. Hold on. Okay, so the width is this way and the length is this way. So there's really no length fall off because I have just basically 512 here. But I'm going to show you a little trick here in a little bit. But anyway, it's the same thing as in the circle. It increases the fall off or decreases the fall off, and you can adjust the values of how well these 3 or 4 spheres blend together. And now that you've seen those settings, let's see what this sphere actually looks like with more spheres. Or should I say, let's see what this circle and this rectangle looks like with more spheres. So I'm going to set this fall off back down to almost 0 so we can have a sharp edge. And as before, to get more spheres, I'm going to take this first level strength step down to 0. And now you can visually see a much better sphere of what's going on. Let's take this radius back down to 512. Or maybe a little bit more than 512. All right, so now you can see we have a much sharper sphere. Let's take the fall off up to 75. Actually, I'll take that back. Let's take it down just halfway. And you can see ever so slightly. I'm just going to drop it a little bit more. Here, this is better. You can see ever so slightly the spheres around the circle's edge is just ever so slight. Same thing for the rectangle. The rectangle, you can see how much longer it is, but I'm going to take this length value up much higher. There you go. And you can see the rectangle is much more prevalent now. I'm going to make this fall off probably a little bit more. So this essentially gives you unlimited possibilities as to adjusting and shaping your terrain. And it's much easier to use these circles and rectangles for whatever amount of spheres you have. That way you can grab a lot of the landscape at once. But you can always go back, select single, and you can adjust just a single sphere. This is very, very handy for when you're wanting to just model really quickly. And in this next property, this is the seamless property. And this takes whatever resolution your terrain is at the moment you click this button right here, and it averages out the perimeter to create a seamless terrain no matter what size you make the terrain after hitting this button. It's very handy for creating a planet or an endless terrain, which will be possible in World Creator 2 at a later date. But keep in mind, when you hit this button, it's basically taking this width and length and making it endless. So let's take the size lock off, just the length to 4K. And you can see it has averaged out these values and continued along the terrain. And in addition to it averaging out the perimeter, you can actually adjust the blend of that perimeter. So if I take some of these values here and start bringing them in, you can see how much it blends the invisible landscape with this landscape from the opposite side. So part of this landscape on this side is bleeding into this landscape on this side. Same thing for here. Part of this landscape down here is bleeding into the top here. If you want a pure seamless texture or terrain, it is best to keep these values set to 1. The next set of properties is the fractal noise properties. These two settings, general strength and factor, don't look like much right now, but they are the driving values for how rough or detailed the terrain is in terms of both general smoothness and height. Let me show you by adjusting the general strength here. So if I increase this higher or lower, you can see the general strength gives you the smoothness in terms of height across all the step levels here. This factor level, to my knowledge, controls how much the elevation values are affected by the generator. So if you can see, if I create a very low strength, but I have a very high factor, you can see the fine details really popping out. But when I put a really low factor and a really high strength, you could essentially get some very interesting terrains of very good height levels. But you don't want the general strength and the factor to be too much on the same par at a higher value. Let me show you what I'm talking about. If I set the general strength at a high value and this factor at a high value, well, it becomes not a terrain. So just keep that in mind whenever you're editing, that you just want a good balance between these two features, as they are the driving factors for the rest of the settings we are about to cover. But if you're unsure as to what you're wanting to do and you've messed up, you can hit D here for going back to the default values. This next adjustment is called the edit curve. And to further explain what I've been talking about, the general strength and factor, this edit curve is the ability to edit essentially the curve, or in this case, the individual factors of elevations in the generator. Let me go ahead and press this just real quick. And you get this whole list of adjustments here. So each of these values here is a different level of detail in the generator's fractal noise that we just edited right above here. So let me show you by adjusting a few of these sliders. It doesn't look like we're doing a whole lot, but keep in mind these values are adjusting the actual Z elevation values in the generator. So this is driving a huge amount of detail across the entire terrain. So that you're aware, this top row of numbers represents the default values set by the engine. And this bottom row represents the values that are currently in play, or the values that you are currently setting. So you can see by me adjusting one up and down, the bottom number adjusts to whatever is actually being seen, and the top number is whatever the default is. And to go back to the default, just hit reset, yes or no, and it'll take you back to the default value. This scale slider here takes your values and expands or condenses the results within the mesh's resolution depending on your settings. So let's just adjust some settings here. And now I'm going to take the scale first to the left side, and you can see it's condensing all of these values into a smaller resolution. Or if I increase it above 1, it's expanding these values across a much higher terrain resolution. This next setting is the edit offset setting. So let's go ahead and click this checkbox and see what comes up. So this feature is taking the mesh and all its generated noises per level step of strength right down here, which I will go over in just a little bit. And what this does is it shifts those values either in the x-axis or the y-axis independently. Or if you click this lock XZ button right here, and I'm not entirely sure why it says Z, it should be technically Y, but in any case, this button allows you to shift the XY values proportionally. But we're just going to click this off so I can show you the rest of the details here. This is especially handy if you're just wanting to shift a detail from one location to another, particularly useful or seen in a larger terrain or higher resolution mesh. To illustrate what this looks like, it is easier to see in a large terrain or a higher level detail such as this. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to shift the step 8 here up a little bit. And you can see the terrain move just a little bit left and right, but let's zoom in just a tad bit more and adjust the level offset of step 6. So I'm going to grab this slider and I move it to the right, move it to the left, and you can see that down here, these general strength values are shifting along the x-axis. This gives you a lot of control. Or here, it gives you a lot of control to shift it on the y-axis. And even the much finer details, you want to move them a little bit. Just play around with these values as you see fit. But keep in mind that the larger steps here are much easier to see when you have a terrain size that is even larger. So when I take, for example, step 1 and adjust it, well, you're going to see a drastic difference, but you're not really going to see that slow movement because we're looking at a 2K image here. If we were looking at a 16K resolution mesh, the step 1 would be able to move visually for you as if we were adjusting this step 6 or the step 7. But you can see you have a whole lot of control on shaping these values and exactly what you want. It's really cool. And lastly, we are finally coming to the level strength steps that I've been mentioning throughout this video. think of these individual sliders as the sizes of details at various stages of resolution that is dependent on your terrain's precision resolution that you set up here. So, and at each level of resolution, you were able to control how strong that detail stands out in elevation or z-axis in the generator. For example, I'm going to take the step 4, I'm going to increase it. You can see that it's increasing just the step 4 values, or I can decrease it and there is none in the generator at all. Let's increase the step 6, or decrease the step 6, increase step 2, and you can see, whoa, you can see that it is adjusting a whole series of how strong that these Z values are in your mesh. So the lower values, or the lower number steps, affect the lower resolution values in the generator and is more prevalent in adjusting the terrain's large scale shapes. So as you just saw, step 2 adjusts a much larger detail, or step 1 even goes much bigger of a detail, while the higher values down here affect the higher resolution values and is seen more granularly in the higher you go. So for a higher level step 7, you can see it adds more granularity, or step 8, it is, let me zoom in. Step 9, you're adding much more granularity to the mesh. And be careful when you do this, because when you do something like this and you get a texture, it could probably make your computer run a little bit more heavy. So just bear that in mind. So I'm going to go ahead and press D to go back to the default values. Yes. And you remember when I said these levels are very dependent on your terrain's precision resolution that we set up here? Watch what happens when I make this terrain 4K. I'm going to go ahead and add it to 4K. If we scroll down here, you can see it adds a step 11 strength level. Why did it do this? Well, think of it this way. If your terrain size is the default 2K and then you bump up the resolution to 4K like we just did, then step 11 is essentially affecting the 4K pixels from left to right across the terrain. Step 10 is affecting the 2K pixels from left to right across the terrain. And step 9 is affecting the 1K pixels across left to right across the terrain, and so on and so forth. So this essentially just adds finer and finer detail the further down the line you go. So what governs these values and their shapes and how they appear on the mesh? Well, it all depends on the seed level that we did in the very beginning, the precision that we specified here, and all the fractal noise properties with the curve, the offsets, the general strength and factor that we just went through. But if we just take a look at the starting values and don't change anything, and then we take this precision level here all the way down, you will see the generated shape on the lowest level. So if you look at this, you can see our precision is every 512 meters at a 2K. So half of this little blob is 512 meters, 512 at this square, and 512 here. So this individual piece is the precision level that you have specified here and the detail that you can adjust here. So if I set this value higher, you can see you're adjusting the dark and light values of the generator. And this is what creates the height value, or the z-axis, of all the fractal noise. So if you're wondering what this shape looks like at higher detail, let me just show you a little trick. So keep in mind, this is what it looks like at the first step. So let's go ahead and increase this up to step 2, or to allow the second step. So this is what you see. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this value for step 1 all the way down, and then I'm going to take the level strength step 2, once I grab it, to 50. And now if you come over here onto the left side, you will see something that looks very familiar. What does this piece right here almost look like? Well, it looks like the same step as level 1 at 100. Let me go back just to show you exactly what that did again. So let's drop the precision and increase this to 100. Now you see this image? Keep this image in your mind, and we're going to increase the precision to 256 meters. Drop the first level step, And the second level step is set to 50. So it's half of the 100 that we had before. And you can see these same blobs appear right here, but now it's every 256 meters. So you can see this little square that was 512 is now 256. And this square that was 512 is now 256, and so on and so on and so on. So let's show you the next one. The precision level of 128. But let's half 50. Let's take level step 2 down to 0 and level step 3 to 25. And what do you get? Again, you see the same detail, but at a much finer precision. So we can determine by this that each and every level step is going to have the same generated height values here. So the darker values are the low terrain, and the lighter values are the higher terrain. So these essentially blend in values when you increase each step on and on and on. So what you're seeing here is a multiplied value from step 1 to step 2 to step 3. This is what creates your very fine details in your terrain. So the best advice I can give you here is not to worry so much about what I just told you. That may seem weird, but instead focus on designing the landscape based on looks and how it feels and what it does to your design as an artist. Don't worry about this step adjusts that type of generated height value, or this step does that. Just know that the purpose of me telling you this is so you know how this works, so that you can get an understanding at what values you can adjust without having to think, what's this going to do? So now that you know the ins and outs of the base tab, in the next video we will be discussing how to use the filters and go over some strategies to consider while designing. Till then, I'll see you in the next one.